So, hi everyone. My name is Saduki. My name is Sarah Dutkiewicz, but I go by Saduki because Saduki is easier to say. Today, I'm here to talk about going from a legacy monolith to microservices via event storming. So, over the past 20 years, I've been in tech dealing with legacy code. Love it. It's probably my favorite. I'd rather be there than in Greenfield, but that's just me. But today, we're going to talk about how do you take that legacy monolith and move it toward a modern architecture. Now, I know it's not a pretty situation, so I've got a tool that will help you with that. But before we get into my content, I do want to take a moment to say thank you to the organizers, because without their organization, this event can't happen. I organize events, and I know what it takes. It takes a good team, and it takes a good set of speakers and a good community, good sponsors. And so thank you to Legacy Code Rocks and the rest of the crew who are helping organize it. Shout out to some of our sponsors too. So Corgi Bytes, Planet Argon, and Deeproot. Thank you. Because without you, this event again couldn't happen. And attendees, I hope you're having fun here. This is such a great experience between the planned speakers and the sessions in the open spaces or the unconference. So hopefully having meaningful conversations here today. Now, if you're doing simple CRUD apps or simple business systems, these solutions are going to be overkill. This is one of those where it's a golden hammer and you see this and you have to use it everywhere. But it might be something that you can use on some of your projects. There are some key terms that I have to make sure we're all on the same page so that as we're telling the stories, you know what we're talking about. So the key terms you're going to hear are legacy monolith, and I will stress that legacy each time. The legacy monolith is that code that we've been lovingly taking care of for many years. But as it grows, it starts to get a little unwieldy to the point where maybe our people are just like, hey, could you add this feature? Just one more feature. We all know it's never just one more feature. It's never just a quick fix. It's never like that. And it's even harder in our legacy code, especially as we're trying to keep it clean, but sometimes we have to deal with production fires and get it done quick. And so our code gets to be a mess. So legacy monolith, we're thinking of the code that we've been dealing with for years. It's gotten us here, so give it some credit, but it's definitely having hard times growing. Microservices. So we'll talk about what I mean about those. We'll talk about the modular monolith or the Modulith, and then this tool called event storming using sticky notes. Now, sticky notes could be something like my physical sticky notes, or they could be something like Miro. So we're working with Miro for the unconference, but you can use it also for event storming as well. The example that I'm going to use is going to be an e-commerce story. And the reason I deal with that is because not only do some of us maintain e-commerce things from a vendor perspective, but we may also be consumers. So these are things like, are you going online and buying merch for your favorite conference? Are you online and buying your groceries? Things like that. That's all e-commerce. So I'm using an e-commerce theme here. So the first term I want to talk about is the legacy monolith and some common characteristics. So you're going to see that it's typically stored in a monorepo. Tightly coupled code, unfortunately, is a thing. If you want to scale a legacy monolith, good luck. It's not easy to do. The release cycles of a legacy monolith are slow. Again, trying to get everything out and trying to work with this tangling, similar to this picture I have here of the tangling of the Ethernet cables with the USB cables with the Christmas lights. It's a challenge. Legacy monoliths are difficult to update. Some patterns you'll see are like the big ball of mud and spaghetti code. So when I say legacy monolith, if you're not wincing in pain of the code that we maintain over the years, know that that's actually what it should be. Now, when I talk with other architects about things, the newer ones are just like, oh, we can do monoliths and we can do microservices. And I'm always the one who says, hold up. It's not a black and white decision. There's that grayscale in between. You can have differing types of monoliths. You could have microservices, or there's the middle ground. But then I always hear, but microservices, it's all about microservices. Microservices. It's not all about microservices. In fact, I've got some words on that here as we talk about them. So we talked about the characteristics of the legacy monolith. Now let's talk about, when we talk about microservices, what do we mean? There's a big quote here from James Lewis and Martin Fowler, but I'm going to distill it down into something even smaller. So it's a suite of small services. They run on their own process with lightweight mechanisms. They're built around business capabilities, not necessarily technical. They're independently deployable. You can have centralized management, that's the bare minimum. But what's nice about microservices, at least from a polyglot standpoint, is that you can have services written in different languages. So if in your tool set, you're like, well, I have a programming language that I know is going to work better. For example, maybe you have like a fraud detection API. And fraud detection is commonly seen with graph databases. So maybe using Gremlin to query graph databases. You can have all that done in one microservice, whereas maybe you have an application process that could be done in another language, like a C# or Java, something like that. So when you have languages and tooling that works well for specialized services, a microservice setup will allow you to have that, where you can use those specialized languages. They don't have to talk to each other using the same language. With microservices, they also can have different data storage technologies. So they don't all go into one data store. They all don't go into, well, they all have to go to relational. No, that's not the case. With microservices, things could go relational, they could go document, they could go graph, they could go just file storage. There are plenty of other things. Not all microservices have to follow the same pattern of storing in the same exact place or in the same technology. You're going to make those decisions based on what's important for that. So when I say microservices, this is what I mean. So they're going to look something like this. So you're going to see that there's here, it's the identity microservice, catalog, ordering, and you'll see basket. Think of it as cart. Now, the other thing to know with this is that the example I'm using here is eShop on Containers. eShop on Containers is one of the .NET reference applications. It's used in many of their samples. You'll see eShop on something. eShop on Web, eShop on Containers, Aspire. .NET Aspire is a newer technology, and it's just eShop. But this is a general shopping setup. Again, notice that these are independent of each other, polyglot friendly. If one of these microservices fails, it should not cause the others to fail. So it's DevOps friendly. This is what we're talking about with microservices. So for the .NET folks, again, eShop on Containers makes sense. Now, there's probably some Java folks here too, or some of the JVM stuff. Spring Pet Clinic has a good example for microservices. So if you're like, I'm in the Java world, but I'm not really familiar with a good example, Spring Pet Clinic will walk you through the different services. So they have a customer service for their pet clinic. They have for the vets or the doctors, the veterinarians, and then they have the visit service. So they have these independent services. If one goes down, they don't all go down. This is using Spring, so you'll see Spring Cloud, you'll see Eureka, and some other specific tools for the Java side of things. All right, so we've talked about Legacy Monolith. We've talked about microservices, just setting the definitions of them so we know what we're getting ourselves into. Some people wonder, well, is it a monolith or microservices? Remember what I said, though. There's that grayscale. You don't have to choose to stay in a monolith world. You don't have to choose to go microservices. Okay, so then how do we choose? Well, you go forth with courage. You're not going to ever refactor complex systems without it. It's never an easy thing to do. As menders, we know this to be true. But as menders, we have the courage to take care of our systems and improve our systems and make them better, because that's what we love to do. So Martin Fowler wrote a piece back in 2015. So here we are 9 years later, but it's still important to understand monolith first. Don't start with microservices, because honestly, probably aren't going to need it. It's going to be one of those that eventually may not come. So if you're like, oh, we need microservices, but not right now, but eventually we'll need them, so let's start there. Not a good idea. Not a good idea at all. So then, okay, you're not really thinking a monolith is what you want. And you're actually listening and deciding that microservices might be overkill. What do we do? Let's talk about this gray area here. This is called the Modulith. Now, when I say Modulith, this term is like how Sudoku is to me. We're taking two words together and shrink them down. So a Modulith is modular and monolith. And when you put them together, they become the Modulith. With modular monoliths, these are typically a single code base, but your code is modularly organized. So you have them in modules, such as maybe you have a books for a bookstore, or maybe you have whatever your items are. You have orders, you have invoices, you have sales, you have different categories, but they're all based as modules. There's a good separation of concerns because of those modules. With a modular monolith, with a single code base, shared services are something that's common to have, because you may see that different modules may need to have certain ways of communicating with each other, for example. Modular monoliths are scalable and flexible. There are a couple things to note with them. So modular monoliths do not have to be async or sync. You can choose which one. There's no rule saying, oh, well, I'm making a modular monolith and therefore it must be async. It doesn't matter. There are plenty of options out there. You can choose to have your interactions between public APIs or messaging. As is true with software architecture in general, the rule is that there are trade-offs for whatever decision you make. With a modular monolith, the other thing to note is that you can see it as the intermediate step between the monolith and microservices. So it's still a monolith, but it's that we're stepping towards microservices. Now, that said, when you're taking those steps, you might be like, maybe microservices are still really overkill. Then stick with the modular monolith if that's what makes sense for you. All right, so legacy monolith, microservices, modular monolith, trade-offs. Let's talk about those. So remember when I said you don't have to go asynchronous, because I've had friends who have told me, yeah, if I go modular monolith, I have to go asynchronous. That's not true. That's not true at all. You can choose synchronous or asynchronous. Notice that they have their pros and cons. Synchronous for newer folks might be easier to implement. Reduce operational complexity, but the problem with synchronous is you've got that strong coupling even in the timing. Asynchronous, again, is going to be things like messaging. So using maybe on the .NET side, stuff like service bus or mass transit. Messaging is great. It could be temporarily decoupled, but it's not always guaranteed to be a loosely coupled situation. There could be some temporal coupling if you don't know what you're looking for. When you're looking with modular interactions in the monolith, the con to asynchronous is that it's a more complex implementation. Not only is it a more complex implementation in terms of creating it and wiring it together, doing all the plumbing or boilerplate, but then on top of it, if it's more complex implementation, it's also more complex debugging. It's painful. It's the nature of async, though. But wait, isn't this still just a monolith? And yeah, I'm making that face that I make on the slide too. When we had the problems mentioned earlier, yes, with modular monoliths, it's still a monolith. But with a modular monolith, it's less spaghetti code, less ball of mud. And you see things like more solid, more dry. You'll see that you can use refactoring techniques a little bit better once you're in the modular state. Now, you're probably wondering, when would you use the modular monolith versus the microservices? Notice that Greenfield is not under microservices. Greenfield is under modular monoliths. If you're just starting out, a monolith will make sense. And so whether you're doing CRUD apps or other apps, you start with a monolith. Okay, let's go. As you realize that there's some low complexity, you're fine in a modular monolith. Low to medium scaling, still okay. Small to medium apps, it's always a relative term, but when you work within your applications, and even though I mentioned Greenfield in early stage, you may also be refactoring legacy code you've worked with forever into one of these just to have them better organized. You'll get a feel for your code to understand what small to medium means and what low to medium for scaling and what the low complexity is. There's no hard definition for that, so you'll know. Modular monoliths are also good if you're working with a team that has expertise in a tech stack. So for example, you may have a team of JavaScript developers, so Node.js developers perhaps. Or maybe you have a team that knows JVM languages of some sort, be it Java or Kotlin or something else. Or maybe they're .NET developers, but they have expertise in just that tech stack. They may not know the other tech stacks. They may not even be familiar that other tech stacks might be better suited for what they're working on. When you have an expertise in a tech stack, a monolith makes sense, because in a monolith, that's going to be the same language in that code base. Now, the other thing then to consider is microservices. When do you use microservices? Use it for large, complex business systems? If you need to focus on scalability, or if you need to deal with fault isolation and resilience, so when a service is down, it should not impact other services. That's a microservices situation. If you have specialized services that involve multiple development teams, that's a case for microservices as well. So if you have specific services that are geared to very specific domains, I see this a lot with finance and healthcare and banking. They have their very specific domains of, how do we say that somebody has a particular credit score and approval, things like that. Those all would have independent teams who have that particular focus on that domain. It might make sense to go with microservices there as well. And the last point, and I know I didn't do them in order, but I still point it out, is the polyglot support. So if you have teams who have experience in multiple languages and do realize that certain languages work better for certain situations, microservices might be the way to go. All right, so with a legacy monolith, you're probably going, how do I get to modular? So your legacy monolith will probably have this kind of setup. If you're getting towards modular, I'm going to say towards modular with the asterisk of you want to get modular, but you might still have things tightly coupled where you might be like, my catalog is relying, or my ordering is relying on my catalog, my basket's relying on my catalog. You might have that tight coupling in your legacy monolith. I've been there. I've seen that. And it gets challenging because all of these things rely on each other. And then they're all hitting the database at the same time. As I look at this, I just think scalability is out the window unless I have it done just right infrastructure-wise. But that's still, so our eCommerce legacy monolith, this is where we're trying to head towards. But again, how do we grow and improve from this legacy monolith? So this was one of those where I learned about a tool from domain-driven design called event storming. And they use it to design software systems, and they think about things. The main question is going to be, what happened? And so when I learned about this technique, it was one where they're just like, okay, we're going to do what's called big picture and thinking about it. Like, we have a business domain. All right. We need to talk about a particular system. We use the question, what happened? That's an event. Now, the more I looked at this process, and we're going to talk more about the process here in a minute, but the more I looked at it, the more I'm like, we can use this as menders. We can use this to help find the problems that we have in our code bases where we need to scale, or we need to make it a little more maintainable. We need to cry less tears at night. How do we get there? Event storming allows us to take a look at the code that we have, understand what it's supposed to be doing, understand where you want to head, and then start sorting things out and drawing boundaries and making it a little bit easier. So I like talking about event storming because even though I learned about it as a greenfield and totally blank page event, exercise. I like using it too for refactoring. All right, so if we're headed toward something like this microservice setup from our legacy monolith or our modular monolith, like this setup, how do we get there? And again, it might be a mess, but we can take this disaster code base that we work in sometimes and make it better. So how do we do it? Through event storming. Okay, so what is event storming? It sounds pretty cool. I mean, there's storms involved, right? So event storming is a collaborative workshop-based experience, and it gets everybody a shared understanding of a complex business system. So if you remember early in this presentation, I said, if you're doing simple CRUD apps, this is overkill. We take the complex problems here, and we sort through the complex business systems. Stress on business systems. You can apply this to technical and have conversations, but it's mostly on the business focus. So when you're doing event storming, there's some key people that you need to know. There's the facilitator. That's the person who asks, okay, who everybody is here? What is the goal? Usually you're talking to somebody in the business who's like, we need to all get on the same page. And the facilitator's like, okay, let's do this. But you get people in the room who have questions about the systems that you're looking at, or the systems you're looking at improving or maintaining. I like using event storming as well to help people who are brand new to a project or brand new to a team, because they come in with no idea, no expectations. And they bring in the outside views and the biases to challenge. So people with questions are there, and the people with answers. So you're going to have like your local experts and their masters in their silo. Now, the things I'm going to show you are going to talk about how we can do this digitally, but the books out there talk about how to do this in person. I'm going to tell you that you can do it either in person or remote. Trying to do a hybrid version of it would be very tough. I've pulled it off, but again, it's a challenge. So what does event storming look like? So event storming has grammar. Now don't panic if you can't read those. I'm about to zoom in on those, so that way you can understand this a little bit better. So sticky notes and conversations are the two key pieces you really need to think. There is a structured grammar, but you don't have to be super religious about this. And the reason I say that, the colors are good when you're talking about all these pieces parts, but sometimes you don't need to get this detailed. So the light green sticky notes, this is given a particular situation, given certain information that is known. The little yellow sticky notes, these are for your users or your personas. So this is, you could have a user. This could be as developers, as a customer. Maybe you have some generic names. Maybe you have a specific user in mind. Something that I find that helps when writing applications and doing event storming is when I'm talking about what happened or what does the system do, I like having a concrete user in mind. I think it personalizes it a little bit more so that those involved are like, oh yeah, well, we still got to think of Sam and what Sam is trying to accomplish here. That's a little yellow sticky. The blue sticky note. So this is just like a regular size sticky note, only in blue. This is a command. So this is do something. When we think about e-commerce, think about place order. Well, when you do a command, there's probably a system involved. And so you think, so systems are pink sticky notes. And they're one of those where you can either be a system, like a physical external system. It could be an internal system that's not part of the situation that you're exploring today. So you might be exploring something such as the shopping process. I love telling this story where I was working on an e-commerce site and we were looking at a shopping process and we realized that we were having some issues at checkout. For the developers, we call back to our ERP system and get all of our data, and that was fine. But for one day, it wasn't working right, and we're able to isolate it down to taxes. Well, it turned out the ERP system relied on another party to deal with the taxes and tax calculations, and that server was down. So that's why things looked all messed up. But the problem was that the rest of my teammates and I had no idea that this tax server even existed. The only reason why we were able to get down there is because we talked to the IT team, and we were just like, well, this is what we've debugged, and this is what's not making sense. So I've drawn out the process of this, and every now and then they are like, oh, that makes sense. So in our case, tax system, an ERP system, and then there's like a shipping system and a delivery tracking system, things like that. These are our systems. They're pink stickies. On some of my drawings, you may see this where you've got the comic bubble with different fonts. So this particular screenshot's from Miro, and the font that I use in my comments here it's called Bangers, and it is very distinct compared to the regular fonts. But these here are the pain points. Who is responsible for the system, or is this always the case? These are pain points, or sometimes they're called hotspots. So one of the event storming techniques that we can use is process modeling. And the other one, big picture. Both of those focus on getting a shared understanding. And sometimes you have to ask these tough questions to go, okay, I honestly don't know who's in charge of this system. And then somebody else is like, oh yeah, that's so-and-so. I'm like, answers, good. With event storming, you're understanding your systems, you're understanding the commands, you're understanding what's happening. You're asking the questions that you need answers for. No questions are wrong. No questions are really dumb. You're seeking a shared understanding. And you'll see that, again, we have the same colors getting repeated. So event storming allows us to lay out our sticky notes. Now, when I actually run the process, I usually start with just the sticky notes, just the orange ones, just the events. And then we build up to adding the others. Alberto Brandolini is the father of event storming, and he says, merge the people, split the software. By merging the people, we're getting everybody together on that same shared understanding. By splitting the software, we can take our legacy monolith, look at it and go, what all do we really have here? And what is its future? Put them all out in sticky notes, and then be able to split the software. Bring it into a modular monolith. So legacy monolith to modular monolith, or legacy monolith to modular monolith to microservices, or legacy monolith to microservices. So there are various ways where we can split our legacy monolith into more manageable chunks that might allow us for more scalability or better maintainability. So that's what he means with the merge the people, split the software. All right, so the types of event storming that are out there, just to kind of set the stage with those. So there's big picture, and its goal is shared understanding, and they're used for discovery or understanding what you're working with. The next one is process modeling, and this one is to address the hotspots. So as you have a question about something that you're looking at on the board, ask those questions. I typically use either the comments or on stickies.io, I'll use the black sticky note. In person, I'll use a randomly colored sticky note that really stands out because we don't want to lose sight of those hotspots. But process modeling allows you to explore processes. Big picture and process modeling are the ones I have used the most, and they're the ones who inspired me to do this talk because they make me think of our legacy monoliths. So then the next one is event storming for system design. There's one for people experience, and then there's one for refactoring. So system design, I like to think of that as you're evaluating a system and proposing a solution. Usually you've got a system in place, but you might be replacing parts, or you might be developing a new system. The event storming for people experience, that's my term. And the reason why I have that is because as you're doing event storming, you'll start to understand the people impact. And so with those, when I do the event storming for people experience, I use a lot of the little yellow sticky notes, but that way people can understand, well, what happened in the system? Okay, now how does this impact our users? How does this impact our stakeholders? You can explore possible value streams as you're going through this. So event storming for people experience, we're still doing the event storming of what happened, but now we're focusing on how does it impact people. Event storming for refactoring, that's where we're at today for this talk, is how do we take our legacy monolith and refactor it? How do we refactor it safely? Did you happen to catch Claire's talk here before this, where Claire was talking about testing? Tests can help with refactoring, but sometimes you're in a legacy code base for so long that you kind of take everything for granted, and you're like, oh yeah, it just kind of does this thing. And then you need other people who are like, well, yeah, it does this thing, but it does this other thing, and it does that other thing much better than you realize. So you need other people. You need outsiders to remind you of that expert's blind side, that your legacy monolith is doing a lot. And it's helping a lot of people too. All right, so with event storming, a lot of sticky notes, a lot of conversations, a lot of shared understanding and questioning things and getting answers to questions. With legacy monoliths, it's what does this do? Where is it headed? Who is involved with all these things? Now, the event stormings themselves, the various sessions. So big picture, typically big picture leads people to discover the various processes that are involved in a situation. So it could flow to process modeling. And then once you have a process in place, then you want to know how do you impact the people? So you go from process modeling to what I call the people experience. Then you could do your big picture towards system design, or you could do big picture toward refactoring. Now that said, you don't have to have an event storming session to go to refactoring, or you don't have to follow this flow. This just happened to be something that I noticed the more I work with event storming, the more I talk with people, is that these systems and these sessions can all flow together to help build a better story of how does a system work? Or in our case, how do our legacy monoliths work? So what if all you have is a legacy monolith? Like I said, the event storming sessions can build upon each other, but they are not necessarily prerequisites. And you don't even have to have any sessions. You can just jump into it. Now, one I'm going to talk about here, event storming for refactoring, I'm keeping it simple so you can adopt this today. We're going to show you the 3 ones that I focus in terms of sticky notes plus the hotspots. So the first one I always start with is what happened. When I do my event storming sessions, I typically have everybody who's involved with that legacy monolith, or everybody who's involved with that program. And by everyone, I mean you've got your developers, you've got your QA folks, you've got your product owner. If you have users who are willing to talk with you, take advantage of that, because your users give you more insights than you can realize. But you get everybody in a room. Now, when I first do this, I make sure that people aren't worried about what other people are doing. And so I'll say, take 5 to 10 minutes, or maybe 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how much time, we'll time box it appropriately. But take some time and think about your system and think about how things happen in your system. Answer the question, what happened? So on the orange sticky notes, write things in past tense. So order placed, order shipped, order delivered, things like that. But put them on sticky notes in front of you. And then the next thing I do is, okay, now let's put it in the collective area, whether it's on a table, on a wall, in a virtual whiteboard example. At that point, then we have to deduplicate everything, which is fine because that's, again, more conversation, more understanding. After everything's deduplicated, then we put them on a timeline to see, okay, can we see if that makes sense? That's when we bring in the who uses the system, what other systems are involved. That's when those all kind of come together. Then the next thing I do with laying it out is I ask, okay, what are your questions? What are your pain points? These hotspots represent questions. They could represent assumptions, or they can also represent risks and warnings. So this is an overall just looking at my eCommerce monolith, some of the things that I could deal with. And we can zoom in so you can see a little bit more, like I've entered payment details, and then that's my customer who did that. And then you see, like, there's my tax system, and there's a user sticky note here. That user sticky note happens to be who maintains that system. So we happen to catch some additional knowledge. When we capture additional knowledge that doesn't fit the colors, then sometimes we just bring in the colors that we have to work with and make notes on there. This is not a hard and fast. You have to use these, because the reason I say it's not hard and fast is because the colors of the sticky notes, they're helpful for sorting. They're helpful for gathering things out and understanding how the system flows. Helpful for when you're writing your code, if you happen to follow something like CQRS, so the command query responsibility separation. So doing all that, I mean, these make sense, but inevitably the main thing is having that conversation and getting to the separation point. The other thing that we'll talk about with this is how we sort them out. Now, the other thing we deal with in refactoring conversations sometimes are commands. So these are usually what trigger the events. And then aggregates, which I don't introduce until the next part. So this part here, this is more like a timeline. This is a what happened, who's involved, what systems are involved, what are the pain points. I like to do this conversation first, so we have a general understanding of what are we working with. Then I like to bring in the commands, so what triggers the events. The aggregates I will save till the end, and that's because we use that to help divide our code into modules or microservices. All right, so bounded contexts, just so that you're aware what these are. So we'll talk about, with these first, the triggering the events and sorting them. And I have a slide here that will show you how we deal with the sliding and the organizing, and then finding these aggregates. Think of the aggregate as it's a large grouping of a business problem. We'll take a look at all these sticky notes. We'll see if there's any pattern there. If there is a pattern there, then we start to group them together. As we group them together, we might realize what the aggregate is, or what is that large grouping of that business problem. Maybe it's orders, maybe it's cart. So once those aggregates are identified, then you can draw your boundaries. This helps for identifying things such as microservices or modules for a modular monolith. Bounded contexts and modules will have similar breakdowns and similar discovery processes. So that's why I'm going to combine them on this. Examples include, in the e-commerce side of things, like product, order, customer, delivery, payment processing, and tax systems, for example. But those, again, I happen to use in my own personal experience, having to deal with e-commerce systems for a lot of my career. So event storming, it starts with a sticky note. If you're in a group with the people with questions and the people with answers, and everybody's afraid to put up a sticky note, that's where somebody like me who goes in and facilitates these events is like, hold up. I might not know your domain really well, but I'm going to just put a sticky note up there to get the conversation started. So I added an item to a cart. As people are coming up with ideas, then they're going to put their own spin on things. So they're going to put their own sticky notes out there. And it looks something like this. So those all did not come in at the same time. And that's because we all think about our events and they just kind of happen. But notice it's a pile of sticky notes. We have to sort through them. We have to deduplicate them. In this particular side, I can tell you there are no duplicates. However, we still need to sort them, because as I'm looking at this pile, I'm going to bring my laser pointer out. As I'm looking at this pile, I'm like, okay, added item to cart. Okay. Something with a checkout. Well, shipping information, that's something else. Shipping costs calculated, that could be something entirely different. Searching for item. Okay, hold up. When we're searching for an item, we're not necessarily dealing with the cart yet. We're just looking at the items and the details. We're not even sure that we're ready to buy this one, let alone that. So you can see as you look at that, you have those conversations of, okay, where do these belong? You don't have to put them on the timeline if you're not doing big picture. If you're ready to just have that conversation for sorting and figuring out your modules or your microservices, then you start sorting things like this. And so they start to make sense. And it's like, oh, that's what's going on. All right. So what I'm looking at here could be something like a cart, maybe. I think down here in this corner, this is probably something like a customer section because they search for the item, they search their order history. This big section looks like orders. So now I'm starting to come up with names that could make sense as aggregates. And so if I go to the next slide, you'll see there's my aggregates. Now, when it comes to the aggregates, you may be like, okay, these all look good. Now the trick to modularizing them or going toward microservices is then actually drawing the lines. And so you'll do something where I do this on paper. I usually do it with pencil first until we have a better definition because of conversations. But when I'm doing digital, I'll just draw straight as is and then edit as needed. And by drawing straight as is, that means drawing like this. I don't draw straight lines. That's a whole different story. I'm an architect who relies on my tools to make straight lines for me. So what you should see from this event storming technique is that you can take a look at your legacy monolith. You can see what you have. And then you can realize, okay, maybe this stuff is tightly coupled and I can eventually make plans to refactor it. But let me make sure I have the right modules, the right groupings first. So with the event storming results, you go from events, then you look at the entities and the aggregates. Entities are usually smaller classes within an aggregate. Sometimes an aggregate is an entity at the same time. Typically, aggregates are entities and they have a way to get in. That gets into the whole DDD process. But you don't need to get into DDD heavily for event storming. You just need it to understand, okay, how do I organize my code? You can create your aggregates with their functions. Once you're done with your event storming, you have a better idea of, okay, the aggregate is going to contain these entities with these things that they can be doing. You saw that I grabbed my pen and it was drawing the boundaries. And those boundaries, again, are good to see because, first of all, those are going to be your guides for modules on the modular monolith side or the microservices, the services. Now, when you're trying to figure out how to split your monolith into these things, you have to make sure that the splits make sense for you. And then again, making sure that everybody's on the same page using the same words. I know we have a few minutes left, so we're going to go through this next part pretty quickly. We're going to talk about, okay, so you have your legacy monolith. How do you go to from a Modulith to microservices? How do you use that as a stepping stone? And that's where Strangler Fig comes into play. So don't think of it as, oh no, I'm killing off my monolith. Well, I mean, you are if you're going straight to microservices. But otherwise, you're going from your legacy monolith to the modular monolith. And then in pieces, parts, doing the Strangler Fig. The Strangler Fig takes care of its host and then kills it off slowly, one by one. Same thing for your going from your legacy monolith to a modular monolith or toward microservices, is you'll kill off parts of your legacy monolith slowly as you add them into modules or add them into microservices. There's always an adapter pattern. Migrate things one service at a time. You want to focus on where you're going to get the best return on investment. And remember that cost isn't just physical dollars, but it's also things like performance and understanding, well, we have this poorly performing part. Well, that might be better to deal with. There's maintenance costs and decoupling time. So this, you need to figure out which services you want to move in an order based on what makes sense for your business or your client. But your legacy monolith or your modular monolith will shrink over time as you go toward microservices using Strangler Fig. If you go wholly microservices, that monolith will disappear. But understand that you may be in that weird half state for a while. Microservices and monolith migration doesn't happen overnight. Focus on the low-hanging fruit. So if you can see an API is an easy win. APIs can then call to the monolith and to the microservices. You can handle the routing with the APIs. Draw out your service dependencies because sometimes that determines your order of migration. But as you're adding new features, if you have this API layer, your new features can be done in the microservices pattern, and the API can handle the routing of, oh, you want to hit this endpoint? Let's go into the new one. You can also look into things like proxies like YARP. And then if they've got specialized development teams, let them figure out the priorities for their specialties. Now, Amazon Prime did have a thing where they were going from serverless and microservices to modular monolith. It was for their defects monitoring tool. There was some costs with infrastructure where it was heavy. And so that was a problem. Scaling limits were getting hit. It was just expensive overall. So then it was one of those where they're like, well, how do we move over to a monolith? And so they moved with vertical scaling for detectors. You see that it reduced their costs and it minimized their latency and made things a lot easier for them. But they didn't go pure modular monolith. They still have microservices, but it is not 100% microservices. It's not microservices all the things, as some people would say. So you have to keep in mind that with its microservices and monoliths, it's not necessarily going to be an all or nothing approach. There is gray area. Amazon Prime, again, wait, they hit capacity limits? Yeah, they hit their own capacity limits. But then again, they rescaled it out. And that helped as well. Okay, so quick recap. Is it all or nothing monolith or microservices? Nope. Always remember that it's gray area. It's a scale. You can stay in your legacy monolith and refactor to a modular monolith. If that works for what you need, then stick with it. If you need to scale to microservices, then so be it. What are the key points for using microservices? Again, that's high business complexity, high need for fault isolation and resilience, specialized teams with polyglot backgrounds. If you need independent scalability, certain services are taking more hits and need to scale on their own without scaling the others. If you need to deal with maintainability, that will grow with those kind of scalability points, that's microservices. About modular monoliths, this is low to no business complexity, cost effective. If you have tight integration, if you have teams that are experts in a particular stack, that's that. And then reduce operational complexity as well. So it's not a lot of overhead compared to microservices. There are some additional resources, both for, in general, microservices and monoliths and moduliths, as well as event storming. And after this session is done, I know it's getting recorded and shared. I'm going to make sure that they have all these links that they can include in the notes as well. So don't panic if you're like, oh, I can't get all those notes. I will send that over to the organizer so they can pass it on. So thank you for coming to learn more about how you can use event storming to take your legacy monolith to modern technologies. If you have any questions, I will be in GatherTown for the rest of the conference. You can connect with me on LinkedIn /in/Saduki. My email address is my first name last name at the company I work for is Nimble Pros. And then, of course, if you need to reach us, you can reach us that way as well. Thank you.